When you hear the words Nobel Prize-winning physicists, what pops into your head? Probably chalkboards just covered in equations, right? A kind of, I don't know, sacred seriousness. Well, today, we're going to talk about Richard Feynman. But here's the twist. We're pushing the quantum physics aside for a bit to really dig into something way more universal. His totally radical, powerful, and honestly playful philosophy for a joyful life.
So, here he is, the man who literally reshaped how we see the universe. A genius mind, a giant of 20th century science. Yeah, this is the image we all kind of know. The serious intellectual, the super accomplished academic. This is the official story. But this is also Richard Feynman, a master safecracker, a mischievous prankster, a bongo player, a storyteller. So how on earth do these two things exist in the same person? Well, that's the whole point. For Feynman, they weren't separate at all. They were the exact same thing.
And this quote right here, this is the key that unlocks everything about him. He believed the universe wasn't some sacred object you had to handle with white gloves. No way. It was a puzzle, and it was just begging to be played with. This single idea that the absolute highest form of understanding is joyful, mischievous play, it drove everything he did.
Okay, so let's see this philosophy in action. Our first stop is going to be, well, probably the most serious high-stakes place you can imagine. And it's here that Feynman turned simple pranks into this powerful tool for finding out the truth.
I want you to just picture this for a second. Los Alamos, New Mexico. It's the middle of World War II. The world's top scientists are all gathered in total secrecy to build the atomic bomb. The pressure is just immense. The whole atmosphere is paranoid, grim, totally locked down. This is pretty much the last place on Earth you'd expect anyone to be fooling around, and that is exactly where Feynman decided to have a little
So Feynman, feeling bored and just being endlessly curious, starts looking at the locks on the filing cabinets. You know, the ones holding all the top-secret documents. This wasn't about being malicious. It was just a puzzle to him. He put his scientific mind to it. He observed, he made a hypothesis, and he found this massive human flaw. Almost nobody ever bothered to change the default factory set combinations. So he just started opening them, one after another. Now, what's really fascinating is what he did next. He didn't steal a single thing. Instead, he'd just leave these little notes inside, you know, something like, guess who? Or maybe he'd just move a document a tiny bit. It was pure mischief, and it was all designed to playfully poke at this illusion of security and just see what happened next.
So you can imagine, the security officers were, freaking out. They were terrified there was a spy in their midst, but they pretty quickly figured out what was really going on. Feynman wasn't a threat. He was actually a teacher. Through his pranks, he was showing them a fundamental weakness in their whole system that no formal, boring report ever could. He was giving them the most effective security audit imaginable, and he was doing it for free.
But see, his pranks were never just pranks. They were little experiments in human psychology. He once took a classified document from a coworker's safe and just put it back later. His colleague never even suspected a breach, he just assumed he'd misplaced it. Feynman loved this stuff. It showed him how easily our sense of certainty can be shaken and how quick we are to blame ourselves instead of just questioning our assumptions.
This playful hatred of false certainty wasn't just for safes, though. He applied it to people, too, especially anyone who took themselves way too seriously. And that brings us to his deep, deep joy in just laughing at pretense.
After the war, his reputation as this eccentric character just exploded. He'd show up at parties and physics conferences and just start playing the bongo drums, like really enthusiastically, and by his own admission, not very well. At academic talks, he was notorious for asking these devastatingly simple questions that would completely reveal when some pompous speaker didn't actually understand their own topic. And yeah, he famously liked to hang out at a topless bar, not for scandal, but because he was genuinely curious about the social dynamics of the place. He even ended up designing their logo and signing it. And this one line just perfectly explains his motive. When his colleagues would worry about his reputation, this was his answer. He wasn't trying to be a rebel just for the sake of it. He was trying to be authentic. He felt that all this pressure to be respectable forced people into a kind of dishonesty, a pretension that he just couldn't stand. For him, laughter and honesty were basically the same thing.
In this rejection of pretense, it leads us straight to the absolute core of his philosophy on knowledge itself. For Feynman, real learning wasn't about appearing smart. It was all about the joy of the process itself.
Here's the difference, and I think you'll get this. Most of us are taught to learn for status. You know, to get the grade, to get the degree, to get the job title. Feynman learned purely for pleasure. He didn't try to become a great artist. He learned to draw because he realized it helped him observe the world more closely. He learned Portuguese because he wanted to actually connect with people in Brazil. He studied biology just to figure out what the heck the ants in his kitchen were doing.
His time teaching in Brazil was the perfect example of this. He walked into a classroom of the country's absolute brightest physics students and was just blown away. They could recite everything from the textbook, word for word, perfect scores on everything. On the surface, they looked like geniuses. But then he'd throw them a curveball. He'd point to some super complex formula on the board and ask a simple, playful question about it. And the entire room would go completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. They had all the knowledge, but they couldn't play with it. They had memorized the names of things, but they had zero real understanding. They'd been taught obedience, not exploration.
And this brings us to one of his most powerful ideas, I think. Most of us are absolutely terrified of being wrong. It feels like failure, right? It's embarrassing. For Feynman, it was the exact opposite. Being wrong was exciting. It meant the universe was more clever than you were, that there was a surprise waiting just around the corner. A moment of error was a moment of genuine discovery, and that was something to celebrate.
So, what does this all add up to? The safecracking, the jokes, his whole approach to learning, these weren't just a bunch of separate quirks. They were all expressions of a single, unified philosophy for how to engage with the world. You can see this one single thread running through his entire life. At Los Alamos during the war, playfulness was a tool to expose hidden flaws. At Cornell, it was a deep commitment to being authentic. In Brazil, it was a method for teaching true understanding. And even at the very end of his life, facing cancer, this philosophy did not waver for a second.
As he was battling his illness, he actually refused treatments that would just prolong his existence without preserving the quality of it. You know, the ability to think, to wonder, to laugh. He would joke with his doctors and ask nurses how their medical equipment worked. His curiosity and his humor, they never left him. Because for him, they were the very definition of being alive. This might be one of his most famous lines, and it just perfectly captures his whole intellectual spirit. He wasn't interested in the comfort of being certain. He was in love with the process of inquiry itself, the endless, joyful, and, sometimes frustrating pursuit of understanding. The questions were always more interesting than the answers.
So ultimately, Feynman's real legacy isn't just a set of equations on a chalkboard, it's an attitude. It's a reminder that in this wonderfully weird, complex world of ours, the most profound way to honor it is to stay curious, to laugh at our own certainties, and to never ever stop playing with the puzzle.
He once defined science with these simple words. But as we've seen, this wasn't just his definition of science, was it? It was his definition of life. The pleasure wasn't some optional extra. It was the entire point. It was the signal that you were truly paying attention.
And so that leaves us with a final question for you. Forget about status for a second. Forget about being respectable. If you take a page from Feynman's book, what's one area of your own life, could be work, a hobby, a relationship, where you could set aside all that seriousness and just start playing? What's one puzzle you could approach with a little more joyful curiosity?